Okay, everybody. Thank you guys so much for coming. We really appreciate you guys coming out. We have an awesome talk for you guys. We have Ben Yu and Simar Mangat over here, and I'd love to kind of introduce them. So Ben went to Harvard. He actually dropped out to become a Thiel Fellow. 2013, he got into crypto. He turned 15K into what is now over $1 million. He wrote the Crypto One-on-One post on Medium, which is a great kind of primer if you're not familiar with crypto. It's a great kind of introductory just overview of the space, and so I send it to a lot of my friends if they're not really familiar. He actually became kind of an internet celebrity in his own right. So he got over 50 million Facebook views on his videos, and he realized that he just didn't profit a dime off of those videos, and so he realized that there was kind of a problem. And so he decided to create Stream, which kind of disintermediates the creators and the audience, and allows creators to kind of profit more and engage more authentically with their audience without being beholden to kind of outside interests. So Simar is the other co-founder of Stream. He graduated from Stanford, where he studied AI and biocomputation. He built one of the top 14 apps in the App Store, which gained him recognition from both the White House and the Department of Education. And he built one of the first iOS apps to do real-time video classification. So I already touched on what Stream does. It disintermediates content creators and the audience, and allows kind of creators to engage more authentically, without being beholden to outside interests. And yeah, without further ado, give it up for Team Stream.
Awesome, guys. Yeah, first off, I just want to acknowledge, thank you guys so much for being here. I know this is lunchtime, really appreciate you guys all coming out and supporting us, and just listening to what we have to say. It's definitely a bucket list item that's always been on my list. So thank you so much for bringing us here and giving us the chance to talk to you guys. So really quickly, I think Bitcoin, right? There's a lot of, if you guys have been following recently, and this is just like a quick story. All the rage. I was literally at Thanksgiving this past Thursday, and I was sitting at the dinner table. And my uncles, my cousins, literally everybody's like, how do I get into Bitcoin? They knew I was in crypto, and they were like, I want to buy, it was like a lot, and it was so interesting to kind of see the energy there.
Cool. So real quick, also, I want to give a quick background of how everyone is in this room, right? So raise of hands if you guys have no exposure to crypto, you guys want just a full introduction. Anyone here who just doesn't know anything about crypto? All right, how many of you guys actually feel like you are pretty proficient, you understand what Bitcoin is, how it works technically, all those things? Raise of hands. All right, a couple people. All right, cool. Awesome.
That's
So
totally, that's
you guys
perfect.
are somewhere between that. Great, this is perfect. That's exactly what this talk is for. So
awesome.
That works well.
So okay, so just really quick, so going back to the story, so she comes up to me, she's like, I want to buy Bitcoin. And then I was like, okay, I feel like this is like a teaching moment. And so I got a piece of paper, and I was like, let's make your own coin, right? And we called it Sarah Coin, because that was her name. And I was like, okay, go and see if you can actually get something from this, right? You have this piece of paper. This is your Sarah Coin. Let's see what you can do, right? And she went, and she actually ended up getting she got an extra slice of pumpkin pie by the end of the day. But one thing that's really interesting, and that was for me, one thing that's really interesting is this idea of what really is money, right? When we think about these coins, what constitutes value in a specific currency, right? And I think that's a lot of what we're going to be touching on today, specifically within our talk, is thinking about what is the history of money in Bitcoin? How does it actually fit in? How have we created this, right? A lot of people think it's a scam, it's fake money, all this. How do we actually think about this and actually diving into some of the fundamentals? Then actually thinking about, okay, what are these next layers of technology? Smart contract, disintermediation, what does that look like? And then finally, we'll kind of close out with, I know there's a lot of new crypto projects coming out, some of our thoughts on crypto economics. Where does that actually have space, right, in the current ecosystem? And what are the value propositions there by actually taking a case study through Stream, the project that me and Ben are both working on. So with that, I'll let Ben kind of take it away with a lot of the history of money and Bitcoin.
Totally. Yeah, you mind if I grab the clicker?
Go for it.
Awesome. So I'm going to walk through a lot of this, but also I want to make sure that you guys are getting the value that you want out of this. So at any point, I'm going to stop and have questions between each section, and then you guys tell us if that's exciting, that's interesting, or if you want to dive into something else. So real quick, I think it's important to take Bitcoin in the context of where it came from, right? And what was the motivation behind it. And it was very clearly motivated by the 2008 financial crisis. So the Bitcoin white paper came out immediately, basically after this happened. And you could see that it was a strong motivating factor because in the first Bitcoin transaction, actually, it had a headline from like a UK newspaper where it was like banks are on the brink of bailout, right, from governments. And so what happened in 2008? Well, it's super interesting because we had a lot of things that contributed to the financial crisis. And I'm sure you guys are all aware, right? The Great Recession occurred. And why it occurred specifically was because of a lot of the parts of the monetary system today. So one of the first main parts of how money works today is fractional reserve banking. So real show of hands, is anyone familiar with what fractional reserve banking is? Okay, awesome, great. So I'll explain this from scratch. So long story short, when you give $1,000 to a bank today, they are legally allowed to go out and spend up to $900 of that money, right? So they have a requirement that they have a reserve that they have to keep of customer deposits, and that's about 10%. So when you give a bank $100 million, right, they only have to keep $10 million on hand. What that leads to are two main problems that can happen, right? In most cases, this is totally fine because if you trust your bank, you're not gonna go out, you're not gonna take all your money out. Very rarely do people take more than 10% of their deposits at one time out of the bank, right? And only when that number is reached are there any problems. So 90% of the time, everything's totally fine. But when people do start to have a panic or people want to take their money out or there's some sort of issue that they're seeing in the system, it can collapse very quickly, right? So you have a liquidity crunch. So if more than 10% of people want to take their money out, then the bank is like, all right, we can't give you money, right? And that's when things start spiraling in a really bad way because that leads to more panic, right? And you have this vicious cycle where more people are trying to take money out. That's not quite exactly what happened in 2008. That's what happened in, say, the Great Depression, right? You had this phenomenon known as bank run, where you see these like lines, right, of people just outside the bank trying to get their money, and that's because the bank doesn't have your money anymore. And the other aspect of this that's really bad, though, is when they spend your money, they put it in investments, right? They're basically taking your money and like earning money with your money. And they can do this poorly. So what actually happened in 2008 was we had the subprime mortgage crisis. So they put money in these highly inflated mortgages that were being lent out to all these people who couldn't really pay it back, right? So then we had this huge problem where they lost a lot of this money. Or now they're left holding these assets in foreclosure, which are just worth way less in reality than they were on paper. And then so the whole system basically started collapsing. And so the government, after the Great Depression, was like, holy crap, this is really bad, because in the Great Depression, all the banks failed, right? And so they created this thing called the Fdic, right? The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So you guys are probably familiar, right now, if you put your money in a bank, it says $250,000 are insured by the Fdic. And this gives you some veneer of like safety. It's like, oh, don't worry, it's fine if the bank goes down, the government's got your back. Well, the fortunate thing is the Fdic is actually just as underfunded as banks, in fact, more so. They are legally only required to keep 1% of all customer deposits that they insure on hand. So, if you can see here, if more than 1% of bank deposits are defaulted on, they actually don't have the money to save the day. And so this isn't just a hypothetical, it's actually happened before. There's a thing called the savings and loan crisis back in the 1980s. And so in rapid succession, and again, things are almost always fine, but when they go bad very quickly and very catastrophically, right? It's a brittle system, right? So everything's okay, but when it breaks, it shatters. And so in the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, 1,000 banks out of 3,200 of these banks that were called like savings banks, right? They failed in rapid succession. And there was actually a sister insurance corporation to the Fdic that was the Federal like Savings and Loans Insurance Corporation. And that immediately was like, holy crap, we don't have the money to like save a fraction of these banks, right? So they actually had to be recapitalized again and again with taxpayer money, which is exactly the same thing we saw happen in, say, 2008, right? Where the governments, basically at the expense of taxpayers, saved all these banks and bailed them out. And in fact, even with all these bailouts that the governments gave, the SLIC or whatever it's called, yeah, they gave up after basically recovering about 300 of the banks out of the 1,000 that failed. All good.
Cool. Keep it.
They actually dissolved themselves, right? And so we've actually seen this happen in practice. So the Fdic, again, very poorly capitalized, just like normal banks are too. So not that much safety. And then this problem is actually compounded by a fiat currency. So this goes back to the idea of like what exactly is money, right? And money today, as we know it, is generally a currency that's issued and controlled entirely by a government and backed by nothing but faith in that government. So in the past, we used to have these things called, say, gold standards, right? And that's something that's pretty easy to understand. It's like, if you have $1, you could redeem it for a certain amount of gold, right? And so you always knew that your dollar had value because it was backed by gold. Now, since the 1970s, since the Nixon shock, we actually have currencies that are completely free-floating, that aren't backed by anything but trust in the government. So this is extremely interesting because what it means is that if you actually look through the test of time, no fiat currency has actually ever survived a long enough time scale. And the reason for that is because you always have a central point of failure in the government. So as long as you trust your government to be very responsible for your money throughout its entire history, then everything's fine, right? It's totally great. But that's a big if, right? And in most cases, actually, you can't actually trust your government to always be perfect all the way through, right? And so they can do a lot of different things. You know, quantitative easing happens. Yep. Now we have, every 4 or 8 years, a new president comes in, right? They change economic policy. And so you're privy to all these things that you don't really have that much agency over, but have a huge potential impact on you. And so we can see this. Some classic examples, for example, are Zimbabwe. Everyone mostly knows, I guess, about what happened there. This is the classic example of what hyperinflation can do. And you can actually see it like really spirals out in this crazy way over time, right? So just in a matter of months, it's like, all right, it's getting pretty bad, like your money's not really worth that much anymore. And it's like, all right, things seem like maybe they're okay, but holy crap, now it's really bad. And so like at the end of this thing, right, it's like you would be in the grocery store, and by the time you entered the grocery store and by the time you left, like your money would have like doubled in like its diluted value. And so they ultimately collapsed, but that is not just, people think that that's the domain of just like, these really third-party governments that are really poor. Actually, it's true right now today in Venezuela as well. But even with the US, when the US first started, few people know this, we created a currency called continental currency back in 1775. And within 3 years, it lost 80% of its value. Within 13 years, it hyperinflated so much that they actually had to completely abandon continental currency and issue an edict that you could only have currency that was backed by gold or silver, because why would anyone trust the US government, right? And so it's interesting in that, so let's move, it's a good segue into basically gold and why gold has held its value as a counterpoint to fiat currencies well over 5,000 years plus. So there's recorded histories of people using gold as a store of value since 3000 BC. To date, it still holds its value. In fact, it's held its value pretty well over that entire 5,000 years, and no fiat currency has ever come close to that. So let's explore why that's the case, because it's a good analog to what Bitcoin has its value proposition, because Bitcoin was actually designed essentially at one form as a better form of gold. And so gold has value because there is no central point of failure. It's trustless in that you don't have to depend on a bank or a central bank or a government to issue gold. You know that so the problem with a fiat currency again is that the central bank can issue money on demand, right? And so when you create new money, you inflate the money supply, but you don't actually change the economy. So if the economy is, say, $100 million and you have $100,000 discount, $100 million, then that's, if someone prints twice as much money, you're basically diluting everyone who holds US dollars today, right? You're halving the money supply. And so actually in practice, we have a designed inflation rate of an average about 2 to 3% every year. And that doesn't seem like too much, but compound interest means that about every 20 years, your money halves in real buying power. So if you have $100 today, it's actually going to buy basically $50 worth of things in 20 years. And so gold solves this problem because it's inherently scarce. You know that there's no central bank that could at any point just make more money. And so because of that, people put a lot of faith in gold, and also there's no one party that you have to trust. And let's see. There are some caveats with gold too, though, in that we think that it's scarce. We think that production can't actually increase, but actually it can, because it's not future-proof. And what I mean by future-proof is we've gotten a lot better at a lot of technology, right? And part of that technology that we've gotten better at is mining gold. So you can actually see here, in the last 100 years, our gold production has about quadrupled, right? So we used to do about 705 tons of gold production back in 1912. Now in 2014, we do 2,880. And that's because it's a lot easier to mine gold today than it was 100 years ago. It's way easier to mine gold today than it was back in like Roman times, right? And so we have this false sense of the supply is scarce, but it's actually not that scarce. And in fact, half of all the gold that's ever been mined in history has been mined in the last 50 years. So this is like a pretty wild thing. And like there are other things that could happen too. For example, someone could spontaneously find a huge cache of gold in California and spark a gold rush. And so there are all these things that, while it seems scarce, it's not quite predictable, and that's important. And so let's compare this with Bitcoin. Let's walk into why Bitcoin has value in the world today as a store of money, right? And so Bitcoin, like gold, is valuable because it is inherently scarce. But more so than that, it's also inherently predictable. And so this is extremely important because in order to be able to really value your money over time, you have to know that, how much money there is, right? You have to know that the money supply is going to be a predictable increase, and then from that you can understand, how the economy is going to function. So here we can actually see this is how gold production has worked over time, or Bitcoin production has worked over time, where at the very beginning of time, we used to, every 10 minutes on average, create about 50 Bitcoins. And then over time that halves, that goes to 25 Bitcoins, 12.5, 6.5, 3.15, and so forth, until it finally evens out at 21 total million Bitcoin. So you can compare these two lines, right? This is how gold production works over time. This is how Bitcoin production works over time. And the reality of Bitcoin production follows this curve exactly, basically. And so how does this exactly work? And feel free to jump into this if you want. But
totally.
yeah, basically, long story short, Bitcoin was designed to be future-proof because it's governed just by code, right? And what we mean by that is it is dictated that on average, one Bitcoin is going to be found every 10 minutes. Or one block is going to be found every 10 minutes. And in that block, there's a Coinbase transaction, an initial transaction that rewards this new 50 Bitcoins or 25 Bitcoins or 12.5 Bitcoins. So how exactly does that work? Well, basically, in order to mine Bitcoin, I'm sure you guys have heard this term of mining Bitcoin, right? It's an analog to basically gold production, but instead of mining it out of the ground, you're now mining it with your computer. How do you mine it with your computer? It uses a one-way cryptographic hash function, right? So it uses SHA-256, which is beautiful because a hash function is something that is one way, meaning that it's trivial for you to calculate the output, but it's extremely difficult for you to actually reverse engineer this, right? And find the input from the output, which means that basically you need to brute force this function. So in more technical terms, specifically what you're trying to do is you have a nonce, an arbitrary increment number that you basically have to run this function through, this hash function, right? So you're trying to find a output that starts with a leading number of zeros. And so the more zeros that this algorithm tells you that you need, the harder the problem is exponentially, right? And so what it can do is it can adjust to the difficulty of how many people are mining Bitcoin at any given time. So say at the very beginning it was just Satoshi, right? The guy who made Bitcoin. He's mining on his laptop, and he can do maybe 1 hash per second, right, of this algorithm, right? He can calculate one SHA function, so he's going through this whole thing. So let's say he can do 60 hashes per minute, and that's 600 hashes per every 10 minutes. So what would the Bitcoin algorithm do? It would say, on average, you're going to find the solution to this problem every 1 out of 600 attempts, right? It's going to make it as difficult as 1 out of 600 attempts. So on average, he'll find it every 10 minutes. But now let's say PS2 compares, or someone else starts mining Bitcoin. What happens? Well, now let's say they can both mine at 1 hash per second, so now they're doing 1,200 hashes per every 10 minutes. So on theory, you should see that they would be finding a Bitcoin every 5 minutes, right? But what the Bitcoin algorithm can do is every 2016 blocks, it readjusts the difficulty. So it's like, all right, how fast are we finding these Bitcoins? Let's actually change this algorithm such that now, on average, you find a Bitcoin every 1,200 hashes as opposed to 600 and so forth, right? And so this is extremely important because it actually means that not only is it future-proof against many people starting to mine Bitcoin, but it's also future-proof against technology that makes it much easier to mine Bitcoin. So at the very beginning, we were using CPUs to mine Bitcoin. That was not that efficient, right? Then we moved to GPUs because that could parallelize the process much better, and that was a lot faster. But now we've actually progressed beyond that to application-specific integrated circuits, ASICs, that can mine Bitcoin because that is better than anything else because that's their sole purpose in life, right, is to solve this SHA-256 hash function. And if this was gold, right, we would be finding Bitcoins like every second, right, as opposed to every 10 minutes. But it's not gold, and so it has adjusted perfectly to the difficulty over time, and difficulty is like this absurd number now. It's like,
Exactly.
yeah. But yeah, so let's talk about some other benefits. So basically, if we were to compare Bitcoin and gold together, then this is the easiest way for me at least to see what the value proposition of Bitcoin is. So in one sense, we have this currency that has value because it's decentralized. Gold is decentralized and it's trustless, right? You don't have to trust any party, and it's inherently scarce. That's what gives it value, because people trust. If I hold gold, no one's going to inflate this thing. It's always going to retain value because other people are going to trust that this thing's scarce. Bitcoin, on the other hand, has all those same benefits, but is even more predictable, right? It's also decentralized. No one controls it, right? No central bank can be like, I'm going to print more Bitcoins, because it's only by the code. And the code is actually very strongly secured by this whole hashing algorithm, right? All these miners that are mining Bitcoin. Basically, you would need at least 51% of all the mining power in the world in order to actually attack Bitcoin and change it. And so there's some technicality there. But actually, I can get into that. So the technicality is very specifically, Bitcoin holds the longest chain to be the valid chain. And so whoever has the most hashing power is more likely to find blocks than someone who has less hashing power, right? So if you have 60% of the hashing power, you're going to find blocks roughly twice as fast as someone who has 30% of the hashing power, at least until the difficulty adjusts, right? And so in that case, if someone has 60% of the hashing power, they could basically control the chain, and they can decide which blocks include which transactions and so forth, right? So that's why if you have over 51% of the mining power, that's when it becomes theoretically possible to control Bitcoin. But again, because everyone's rationally self-interested in trying to get as much money as possible, there are a lot of miners, right? And they're all basically fully decentralized across the world, so it's very difficult for any one person to get 51% of the power once Bitcoin gets so large. And so, again, Bitcoin's very secure, very trustworthy, because you don't have to trust any central party. There's no central point of failure, and it's inherently scarce. But not only is it inherently scarce, it's also inherently scarce in a very predictable fashion. So those are the benefits on top of gold. But the other very important benefit, the one that Satoshi really wanted to drill down in, is that it is an easily transactable currency. So you couldn't go around with like a pound of gold, right, and like shave off like a small amount to like pay for your coffee every day, or like, you know, your bus ticket and all that. People would be like, what can I use this for, right? And you really can't use gold that well. In fact, it can only be used in person, right? You can't send it to someone in China easily. You can't mail them gold or something. Well, you could, but it would be terrible. But Bitcoin, on the other hand, is extremely trivially easily transactable to anyone in the world, because this is something that people say is like a downside of Bitcoin, right? They don't understand that, like, they're like, it's intangible, right? Like, at least with gold, I can hold it in my hand, right? Or paper, you know, like I can use it as toilet paper or kindling if I needed to, right? There's like some tangible value to it. Bitcoin is this completely intangible concept. Actually, that's a strength of Bitcoin, right? Because what it means is that it's extremely easy to transact Bitcoin across any border, right? There's nothing but information that constitutes the value of Bitcoin. Therefore, you can transfer it extremely well. And so, by its native state, it was designed such that, you know, it is as easy to send a transaction for a cup of coffee, $3, right, anywhere in the world locally, or to someone in China, or to someone in the Philippines, right? You can buy a car with it just as easily and just as cheaply as you could buy a cup of coffee. So that's very powerful. And then, so let's talk about some hesitations that people have and skepticisms that people have about Bitcoin. And so the first one that they say, right, is that, you know, there's no intrinsic value, right? There's nothing here that I can hold in my hand, right? And so the counterpoint to that is, this is a point made by Sapiens, actually, really well, where money ultimately is just a denotation of the amount of trust that people hold in that form of money. So what I mean by that is, actually, if you look at gold, right, you can say, sure, gold has value because it can be used as jewelry, or it can be used for industrial purposes, right? We put it in our laptops and things like that. But actually, if you calculate the value of gold today and how much of it is used for industry and jewelry, it's about 12% of the value of gold is actually what's used for industry. The rest of it, all 88% of it, comes from thin air, basically, right? Like, what accounts for that rest of the value? Well, that's actually just the trust that people have in it as a currency, as a commodity, as opposed to the value of it as a jewelry or, you know, industrial use case. Same for money today, right? You say this thing has physical, tangible, like, value, right? I have a piece of paper in my hand, but actually, how much does it actually cost? What is the value of that piece of paper? It's about 5 cents for the government to make a dollar bill. So where does that 95 cents of, like, you know, value come from? It actually just comes from trust in the US dollar, right? It comes from trust that this thing has value. So ultimately, in that sense, Bitcoin can be seen as almost the most pure form of money, because it is nothing but trust, right? It has abstracted away the need to have any tangible component. It is just this intangible component of trust, and that's where its value comes from. The other big question and skepticism that people have about Bitcoin is, like, what can you actually use it for, right? And so they're like, you know, it's used for drug money, right? It's like this illegal money that people spend, or, you know, it's really just black market stuff right now, right? Like, no one's actually using it to, like, pay their salaries and this stuff. And one, that's actually changing very quickly. But two, Bitcoin is a nascent technology that's just been formed, right? And this is a criticism that has been lobbied time immemorial to basically every single new technology that's happened, right? So this is one of the most interesting articles. It was a famous article back in 1995 by one of the first pioneers of the internet, actually. And so he wrote this huge thing on Newsweek, and he's like, all right, everyone's like super excited about the internet today, right? They think it's going to be like this magical thing that's going to change everything about what we do, right? And like this is just all bullcrap, because like they talk about things like we're going to have libraries online, we're going to have like town meetings, we're going to have commerce and business is going to somehow shift from offices and malls, right, to like the internet, right? And like we're going to have things that like make government more like democratic, like no. And then he's like, this is just all totally false, right? Like no CD-ROM or online databases can like replace your newspaper, right? Nothing like this is ever going to happen, all that. And the funny thing is, he's totally right. He was absolutely correct back in 1995. None of these things were remotely possible, right? There's all these like visions, like these far-fetched plans that people had, but none of them were possible then. But all of these things have come true today, right? And so that's where it's interesting in that like people who are focused on what Bitcoin is today, I believe, are taking it from the wrong time scale, right? In fact, even if you were to take Bitcoin and just compare it today versus other forms of money, it's done incredibly well, because what? Gold has a 5,000-year head start. US dollars have a 300-year head start. If you were to compare them on the same time scale, actually Bitcoin is one of the best performing currencies in 9 years, right? It's gone from basically nothing in value to over $170 billion in value in just 9 years. Compare that to continental currency, the US currency, right? In 9 years, it was actually hyperinflating. It was basically going down to zero at the same time that Bitcoin has retained its value and skyrocketed. And same thing with gold, right? Gold's value is about $7.5 trillion for the total sum of all the gold that's ever been mined in the world. Bitcoin, 170, that's about 1/40th the size of the whole market value of gold in something like 1/2,500th of the time, right? That it took to get to that value. So that's the other point that is interesting.
Yeah. So just really quickly, wanted to dive a little bit into some of the technical pieces, because I think one thing that's been interesting is like, why isn't this has been done in the past? There have been currencies and other things. Why haven't they worked? And I think one thing that's really interesting is thinking about actually what are the technological innovations within Bitcoin that has made this possible. And Ben touched on some of these, but one key problem that often comes about is like there's the double spending problem. How do you ensure that money isn't sent to 2 different accounts? How do you ensure like authenticity of transactions and all these things? And part of this kind of just comes down into very simple like cryptography, breakthroughs in cryptography, and the way that was manifested in Bitcoin was really, really profound. And so specifically, right, for those of you guys, how many of you guys actually own own some amount of cryptocurrency or Bitcoin? Just put quick show of hands. Wow. Awesome. One of the most profound things for me was like, the first purchase of cryptocurrency, and one, of course, is done through an exchange, but then recognizing, for example, public-private key pairs. Like, what does that actually mean? And actually, show of hands, how many people know what like a private key is or a public key is within the context? Yeah, a lot of you guys. Yeah, it's huge, super, super important. This basically a way for people to communicate and ensure that the signature and the person that is sending said message, right, is actually factually, correct. Transactions, another really interesting idea, and this guy actually goes into the idea of blockchain, and basically this idea that transactions kind of point to the next transaction, right? The blockchain, you basically have a linked list of different transactions that are coming in, right? That are overall being mined, as Ben said, right? And then added basically to a node, right? Like basically the mining is calculating this block hash ID. You as a person send a transaction that goes into a memory pool. All these transactions are put into a block. That block is now appended to the node. That node is then broadcasted, right? The chain is then broadcasted to the rest of the network. So just in terms of some profound realizations here, like Bitcoin as a technology, like ultimately what are you trusting? What are you putting your faith in? It is that you have basically this global ledger, right, of everything that is happening and complete transparency into how the system works. You're not looking at a bank and wondering how it's printing you money, how everything is happening. It's a completely clear and transparent system, enough that people can believe and trust that the system works, right? That so far, yes, there are these clear technicalities and points of vulnerability, but that a lot of that, right, in terms of how we're moving forward, right, with scale, the fact that you need to take 51% of all the mining hash power to be able to actually like inflict an attack, like of course there are all these problems, but at the same time, there's an enormous amount of technical stepping that has been going forward that has actually pushed a lot of blockchain and a lot of Bitcoin right now and will continue to in the future. So this also now brings us to questions, because I know we covered a lot about Bitcoin and money and a lot of these pieces, and we just want to take a really quick pulse to see how people are feeling. Yeah, question. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we'll repeat the question every time it is said.
Okay.
Great. Awesome. Yeah, question.
Ben made a couple of claims about the value of gold relative to the intrinsic value of Bitcoin, and in particular, a claim that 80% of the value of gold was sort of an investment or speculative operation versus only 12% of gold actually used for industrial purposes. But the demand for gold for industrial purposes is very elastic, right? So if the price of gold were to start dropping, the usage of gold would skyrocket.
Absolutely. Yep.
But that's not the case for Bitcoin, right? That 12% of industrial use, because it's elastic, means that it's going to act as a dampener on the other 80% of the speculative value.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, just to quickly clarify, was that the
long one. Yep.
So just quick rephrase of the question. Ben talked about gold, 12% being, right, it's kind of industrial purpose, serves as a dampening effect. How does that factor it? Like,
Absolutely,
right,
great question.
Talking about the elasticity of gold.
Exactly, yeah, so that's beautiful. And again, anything that you guys saw that I said that you guys have skepticism about, that's what we want to tackle right now, right? Because that's a fantastic question, because what that means is that's basically a transactional base for gold, right? It means that even if we wiped out all the value of currency that gold has as a commodity or a currency or like speculative value or anything like that, there would be some use case as industry. And you're right? Like that amount would go up as the price of gold fell. So it would provide a base value, right? But actually that base value is just the thing that you would abstract away from like the rest of that currency's value. So what I mean by that is like, let's say, what is that elasticity point? So say gold's industrial value is $1 trillion or something like that, right? And like if everything else was removed from, no one trusted it as a currency, it was only used for those industrial purposes, then that would be basically the entirety of that economy, right? It's like
No, that would
so,
not be the entirety of the economy. Because supply and demand is going to dictate that as the value drops, you're going to have more industrial uses. For
absolutely,
that
yeah. But there's a cap on the market cap, right, of all that gold. It's how much people are willing to pay for it, and so that would be at some point, right? It would be certainly lower than 7.5 trillion today. So, like, for example, I'm saying like, how much is everyone in the industry willing to pay for those industrial use cases of gold? You're absolutely right that they would consume all the gold available, right? They would certainly consume all the supply, but they wouldn't actually pay $7.5 trillion for it, right? They would pay some fraction of that price. Does that make sense? Like, you're saying it's elastic, right? So they'll pay maybe half the price of gold today. They'll consume twice as much gold, right? At half the price. Is that what you mean by the elasticity?
Correct.
Yep.
Basically, my point is that even if everyone today decided that, I don't want to store my gold.
Absolutely.
It's not going to lose 80% of its value. It's going to lose,
somewhere in
some
between, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. So to be specific, right? It's like if the price goes down, they're going to consume more gold, but they're going to be paying less for it, right? So that the market cap is still dropping, right? So because like if you're consuming twice as much gold at half the price, then you're still actually contributing to the same market cap, right? So that's basically what I'm saying is that like, yeah, you're absolutely right. It wouldn't drop all the way, but it actually probably would be somewhere in between, what they're paying for gold today and where gold is today, right? So it certainly would drop. But then again, what we're focused on is that difference in that, the difference between all the money that industry would pay for gold and where gold's price is today, right? And so that's basically, there is certainly some difference there. But even so, right, like you can actually make that same argument for Bitcoin, right? There are actually transactional use cases for Bitcoin. For example, you can say there's Western Union, right? It basically eclipses Western Union in all of those payment purposes. So Western Union is about a $10 billion currency company today, right? There's about $10 billion of value in money transaction between people in the States and like people in the Philippines and so forth, right? And Bitcoin actually has that same kind of industrial use case, right? And there are a lot of other use cases that are coming out over time. So yeah, basically there is certainly value there. What we're trying to segment the way is that there are many different ways to value what Bitcoin is worth. Gold is only one of those value cases. And specifically when I talk about gold, again, it was just about the difference in that industrial value, abstracting that away, and then the remainder of the value over time. And so you're right that there are like other things that contribute to the price of gold or Bitcoin. In fact, this goes into something that we're going to talk about later. Is there are a lot of applications that you can build on top of Bitcoin that contribute to value beyond it just being a currency, right? Being a currency and the value that people hold in it as a currency is just one facet of all the different reasons that Bitcoin would have value. So that's a good point.
We'll take questions. Just in the interest of time, we have till 1 p.m. Yeah. So we'll now just batch all the questions till the end, so we can cover some of the rest of the stuff.
Well, let's do maybe
one or two more.
Yeah,
great. Yeah, it's 12:40. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Oh wow, that's fast.
I have a mic here.
Test. Thanks. I think your explanation of why Bitcoin is superior to U.S. dollars or gold was fantastic. The one question I have is about kind of the volatility of how much a Bitcoin is worth. If a bank run or something like that can really affect the value of a U.S. dollar, it seems like there's a lot of events that could also similarly affect the value of a Bitcoin, different governments making regulations about it, et cetera.
Yep.
And just looking at the price of Bitcoin, it's always fluctuating wildly. So how can it be used as a useful form of currency with that being the case?
That's a perfect question, exactly. So there are a lot of things there that you're talking about. So one is if a currency is a measure of its trust, right? Then there are certainly things that can demean that trust over time or damage that trust. And you're exactly right. Like say the US is wait a minute, why do we want people to use Bitcoin over the US dollar? Let's ban Bitcoin. And they actually can, right? There are central points of vulnerability. They could ban exchanges. So the question again is what happens with the volatility of Bitcoin, right? It's how can you have a currency that people trust, that people want to use as a global digital daily currency if they can't believe that's going to hold its value well, right? Because it keeps going up or it keeps going down and so forth. And so there are two ways to answer that question. One, actually, you can see the volatility is something that has been decreasing dramatically over time. So right now we see swings maybe at most of about 20%, right? But that is massive compared to most currencies. But actually, at the very beginning, right, you could see Bitcoin drop from $30 down to $2, right, or $1 down to 2 cents. And so actually, right now, the volatility that we see in the system is far less than it was before, and this will only continue to decrease over time as it gains more adoption, right? It's just a function of a small cap versus a large cap, and so that's one part of it. The other part of it, though, is a really good question that a lot of people do say, even if you have a currency that is just appreciating or the volatility isn't going down, a deflationary currency over time is a bit of a problem as well, that people are encouraged to keep their money as opposed to spend it, and there are some questions there. But then price stability in of itself is a valuable thing, right? You can't say one cup of coffee is 1 Bitcoin today because in 10 years it's going to be $17,000, and you're wow, that sucks, right? But what is interesting is there are actually some solutions around this, right? So how the US government does it is they have a central bank. And the central bank makes sure that the money always inflates at 2 to 3% a year, no matter what happens in the economy, right? And they can do this through two things. They can inflate the money supply when there's more demand for it, right? So when more people have trust in the US dollar, they just print more money. They print $1 billion new dollars. And they can actually capture that money themselves, right? That's real money that they printed, but that dilutes everyone else, right? So that puts the value of the US dollar down. And in the reverse, what they can do is they can actually issue bonds, right? To constrict the money supply. So when people lose trust in the US dollar and starting to lose money, what they do is they issue bonds at a yield. And what that does is it reduces the amount of money in the system, thereby driving up the price of each US dollar. And actually, you can do this in the world today too. So there's an extremely interesting currency that's coming out. It's called Basecoin. And they do exactly this. They're an algorithmic central bank. So what that means is they basically, by their algorithm, not through a normal central bank that's controlled by 5 people, they are able to say, if the money supply grows, you're able to print more money to dilute the money supply such that the price remains stable. And in the case that the money supply, people are losing faith in this thing and they're selling their Basecoin, they can actually issue bonds that are redeemed in chronological order with increasing yields, such that if you at any point believe that Basecoin will retain its value and go back to the $1 stable value, then you would be extremely rationally motivated to buy these bonds because you'll get free yield on it, right? When the price goes back, when the trust is retained again in the future, you'll just get 10% of more Basecoins or something like that. So it's very important to find a system that has price stability, but at the same time, you want to capture the value from the growth of that currency over time, right? So these are two different things that we're trying to do. And the government does this by just saying, don't worry about it. We'll take all the money, and you guys don't have to worry about this value that's appreciated, right? We'll just capture it ourselves. But ideally, you would like to capture that value yourself, right? You want your Bitcoin to go from $5 today to $17,000, right, in the future. But you also want to be able to price things in this currency. Well, how do you solve that? Well, instead, what you can have is a system where you can say, for example, this cup of coffee is 3 Bitcoins, and 3 Bitcoins are always $1. And in 5 years, instead, you still have all the value that came from the growth of that currency. Instead, what you have now is it's still 3 Bitcoins is still worth $3, right? Each Bitcoin is still worth $1 each in 5 years. Instead, now you just have 17,000 Bitcoins that are all worth $1 each, right? So that's an interesting system where you can have price stability, but also still capture value from the growth of the currency over time. So, yep, we'll jump forward. So yeah, so now basically what we'll jump into is some of the most promising future applications of Bitcoin's blockchain technology today. So what we've seen in the past, I don't know.
Yeah, so really quickly. Yeah, and I know we're running short on time. So really quickly, so Ethereum also gets into some really, really interesting pieces. Turing complete language, amazing in that actually, for those of you guys that know what, I mean like for a Ethereum having EVM, which is Turing complete, allows the creation of basically, right, anything that you could potentially code up, right, like in any sort of language, you can actually translate into Ethereum, which is one of the coolest things in my opinion, because now you can actually have complex interactions that middlemen, right, and market makers tend to perform right now, actually be able to be codified into smart contracts, right, and then actually be implemented on the network with some financial base at the back of it. So I think we'll skip through this because I know we're running short.
Yeah, so I'll give
time.
a quick example of like the future potential of what smart contracts can do. So for example, basically what Bitcoin has done is it's disintermediated this middleman, the government, right? The government was what you needed to trust before as a third party that could control and create your money, and you gave them trust because they're trustworthy, and they're the only person who could be trustworthy. But now, in fact, anyone can create their own currency, and people can trust it because you know that like it will be dictated by this code, right? That's exciting, but actually what's more exciting is that you can actually do this with any kind of industry, right? So you can do the same thing, for example, with the legal system. So a smart contract is just a piece of code that dictates what happens, but like on top of it, there's some currency aspect. So let's take an example. Say you want to make a bet with some random person that Donald Trump will remain president at the end of 2018, right? And so today, if you were to say, let's do this $100 bet, right? And if you did it with a complete random stranger, you wouldn't, because you'd have to trust that they would like honor this bet, right? And so in today's world, right, let's say even if you have a written contract with this random person and you're like, all right, we'll pay each other $100 based on who wins this bet, right? I think that Donald Trump will be president, you think that they won't, and then at the end of that time, say I'm right? And that person's like, oh, never mind, I don't want to pay you. Well, what's your recourse? You'd have to go through the legal system, right? And like the cost and the time of going through the legal system, which is this extremely inefficient kind of middleman that arbitrates all these discussions today, is something that would almost certainly be more than like this $100 bet, right? So it would never be worthwhile for you to go through a system. Therefore, you would never be able to make a bet like this, right? So there's huge inefficiency that reduces the ability for us to have all these economic transactions, right? In fact, with a smart contract, we can completely obviate that system, right? We can abstract away the need to trust this third party to make a bet like this. In fact, we don't have to trust the other party at all. We don't have to know them. They could be some random person on the internet. And we would say, all right, Alice and Bob, they want to make this bet. So both of them agree to the smart contract. They put their money into the smart contract. It goes into escrow, right? So now the smart contract holds $200. And then at the end of 2018, the smart contract can ping an oracle or source of truth, or there's a game theoretically secure way for you to actually have an economic like incentive for people to tell you the truth. And then at the end of that time, it just says, all right, Alice won the bet. We send all $200 to Alice, right? So now you can see that you can actually have really interesting things where you reduce a lot of inefficiency and you reduce the need for a middleman to make all these kind of applications possible.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Well said. So fundamental value proposition is abstracting the need to trust and depend on any given middleman. And that's like a lot of the core value proposition, for example, of Ethereum and a lot of the D applications, so D apps that are being developed on top of Ethereum, is that you now basically have this currency, right, in which, right, for example, the code and Ether specifically as a currency is being used to actually run the logic within the code, right? And which is like one of the coolest like paradigms is this idea of a world computer, right, that is now decentralized, transparent in terms of how it functions, and allowing, right, people to write these functions, these applications in the same way, for example, on top of the internet, their websites and other things created. So this flow of information and this flow of logic in particular, this is actually my first foray into cryptocurrency was Ethereum because it was so exciting from a technical perspective. And so if we actually think about this down the line, right, we have blockchain, we now are able to actually encode complex pieces of logic, right, in some sort of way through Solidity and through smart contracts, actually be able to execute a lot of this stuff. What can we do with that, as a result, right? And I think for those of you that have been following the ICO space and a lot of crypto projects, this actually opens up some really, really interesting doors in terms of what people can do on top of something like Ethereum through an ERC20 token, right? Which is like kind of the standard in terms of tokens that are built on top of the Ethereum chain, so using the Ethereum blockchain to execute specific things, as well as like other blockchains that have come. So in particular, what we're going to do is actually take Stream, what we're working on, as somewhat of a case study in terms of thinking about actual value accrued in a lot of these crypto projects.
So we want to get to your questions too. So I'm going to actually just do a very quick explanation of all the things that are relevant and like what is an exciting use of blockchain technology that we see. And then, if you guys want to learn more about anything, just let us know what questions you guys have. So very specifically, what's a fascinating thing now is we basically democratize the creation of money, right? It is no longer a domain of a monopoly. So specifically, the monopolies that could before create money were governments, right? They were the only ones who had the trust that people would place in it to be able to create money. Now anyone can do it. So what can you do with that? Well, you can actually do things, for example, like make sector-specific currencies. What's extremely interesting about that, and what I mean by that, is a currency that specifically just tracks one industry or one sector or one economy. For example, in our case, we're tracking video streaming or content distribution. Well, what can you do in that case? Well, you can do two extremely interesting things. One, you can shield that currency from global volatility. So right now, for example, there are many different factors that impact the price of a US dollar, right? Maybe oil prices fall somewhere in the world, or like they rise or something, and like that impacts you even if you have nothing to do with oil, right? Even if you have nothing to do with the economic policy of the government and so forth, right? You're just like a video maker, right? You're like, why am I being impacted by this? Well, actually now you don't have to be, right? You can have a currency that specifically is valued based on its use case in a specific industry, such that the other fascinating thing that happens here is you have incentive alignment within this industry where you can create strong motivations to create a virtuous cycle of increasing network effect. And so what I mean by that is now you can create a currency that people all directly benefit from when it grows, such that you're highly motivated to make this industry grow. So let's take a very simple example. So we have, say, a Stream token, right? So let's say we create this currency. We have 100,000 Stream tokens. It's a completely finite number, right? And let's say, for example, in our case, right, the use cases are like live streaming tips. It's a $5 billion industry right now, or Patreon-esque models and so forth, right? People sending money from users to content creators. So say people convert their other currencies into this currency, use it for those cases. Now people have converted $100,000 of those currencies. So now we have 100,000 Stream tokens, $100,000 as a market cap. So you would expect each Stream token has about $1 value. But, oh yeah, perfect. And now let's say this grows over time, right? As more people want to use this currency for the goods and services I can provide, we now have, say, this thing grows to, in my example, I'll just say $500,000, right? So now we have 100,000 Stream tokens, a market cap of $500,000. That's about $5 per token. This is the naive model that, say, Bitcoin takes, right? It's just that you capture the value from the growth of this economy by basically having each unit of value be worth more over time. But that's actually not the most interesting thing that you can do. What you can do in this case is actually similar to what a central bank can do. You can emit more tokens. So let's say we actually emit 400,000 new tokens. So now we have $500,000 in this economy, we have 500,000 tokens. So we don't change the size of the economy by printing more tokens. But over time, discounting velocity of money, you would imagine that it would revert to this fundamental mean where we have $1 per token still, right? You have 500,000 tokens, $500,000, but we have literally created $400,000 of real new money, right? So what can we do with that? Well, interestingly enough, we can distribute that back to everyone who has contributed to the growth of this economy over time to incentivize them to grow the economy. So let's say we split this in the most simple way, we can split 50-50, right? We take 200,000 of these new tokens that we made with $200,000 of real value. We give it to everyone who held tokens today. So if you had one Stream token worth $1, now you have 3 Stream tokens worth $1 each, but 3 times as much. But we also have $200,000 of new money that we created. And now that money we can actually distribute back to, say, content creators, right? The people who have made these videos, such that now they have a revenue stream without any direct cost to users that incentivizes them strongly, such that if you have, say, 1 million views, you would just possibly, if you have like 50% of the views of everyone on this platform, let's just say, right? You have $100,000 that we give you in Stream tokens for free, right? For having contributed to that network effect. So you can strongly engender someone wanting to contribute to that network effect over time. And so now we've created a new revenue stream that basically was once the domain of just governments, right? It's a silent tax on everyone who holds US dollars today, is that if you take the US dollar, you would see that the US economy does keep growing over time, right? So as the US economy kept growing over time, if you had a finite supply of US dollars, you would imagine that each US dollar should have more buying power over time. But it doesn't, right? It actually depreciates by about 2% or 3% every year. And the reason for that is because, well, that value has to be going somewhere, right? Someone must be capturing that value, and it's the government, right? When they print more money, they capture it themselves. And for the first time, we have an opportunity to actually distribute that back to the people who are actually responsible for the growth of that economy over time. So that's just one real quick thing. There's a lot more to it. But yeah, want to open up for questions?
Exactly.
You guys have anything you want to dive in more detail with?
Yeah.
So what are the biggest risks that you see for cryptocurrencies today?
Yeah.
That's a great question. So personally, my philosophy is this, right? I see that. Oh,
What are
yeah,
the biggest
perfect, great
risks?
question. Yeah, what are the biggest risks for cryptocurrencies today? So there are a lot of things that can happen, and it is a lot of them I would consider to be black swan events that are almost inevitable in the short term, but in the long term. So what we can see is I actually consider cryptocurrency to be this concept of expected value, right? Like plus or minus expected value. It's a term that's often used in poker, right? So in poker, it's basically a denotation of probability. It's like, I would say maybe even if Bitcoin has a 90% chance of failure, it can be a good bet for you to put some of your money into. If in that 10% that it succeeds, you expect it to succeed more than 10x, right? Then that's a positive expected value bet. So let's see, what are those things that could cause it to happen? And I actually do believe that still it's an extremely high risk speculative investment, right? And so that said, again, it may be worth your money being put into this thing if you believe that the expected value is over that. So in the short term, this is why I don't day trade, right? I think it's actually easier to see and predict what possibilities Bitcoin may have in the long term than the short term. What are the immediate things that can happen? For example, what are the things that actually cause the price of Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these things to drop the most? There are black swan events that happen that you fundamentally can't predict. You can have pretty good assurance over time that they will happen, but you don't know when they'll happen. So for example, in 2013, the price of Bitcoin went all the way up to $1,200. And then it cratered immediately because Mt. Gox was hacked, right? Mt. Gox lost hundreds of millions of dollars. That immediately made the price fall and become stagnant for the next 3 years, right? It went all the way down to less than $200. So over 80% or 85% fell. And for example, another thing happened with the DAO. So Ethereum, again, has all these enormous potential applications in that you can create smart contracts. And smart contracts, again, there's Turing complete code. That code can basically do anything. So for example, they have this concept of decentralized autonomous organizations. So take Uber, for example, right? Uber is a company that, technically it's a company today, but it's really just code, right? There's no reason you couldn't just have this code be a Turing complete thing that you put into the blockchain and it would just run by itself. And you wouldn't even need a company to run it, right? It would just be decentralized and autonomous. It would run by itself. And so the first concept was this thing that they created that was called the DAO, right? It was like self-named. And there was an investment fund. And they said, everyone put your money into the DAO, and we're going to have you all vote on where you want this money to be invested. And they thought this was a good idea. I'm a little skeptical. But they put $150 million into this thing, and people were super excited. But it didn't even crash because they made bad investments. It failed because someone found that code is law, right? But code is fallible. Code is written by humans that can make mistakes. And so the code had an exploit where someone could actually siphon the funds directly into a child DAO, right? And basically control it themselves. And so they were like, holy crap, this is terrible. Ethereum was rising all the way up to $22 at that point. And then the DAO had this hack, right? Someone stole $50 million. And they actually had to hard fork all the DAO to retrieve the funds. But in that time, Ethereum fell down to $7, right? So in the short term, those are the existential risks I see, right? Regulation can happen, right? China says we ban all ICOs, that creates a market. The US is like, we're going to ban exchanges, right? That creates a market. Those are all the short-term existential risks that we see. Maybe some of those are large enough that they, so far damage the trust in Bitcoin that it doesn't get to the long term. But actually, I think these are all things that you can't predict when they'll happen or how they'll happen or any of these things. They're just inextricably tied to just uncertainty in the short term. But in the long term, actually, I think there are the only the big risks is that some the governments or something, right? Try to tackle this thing and attack it so far that it doesn't get off the ground, or they replace it, or say quantum computing, for example. Technically, the hash function that protects Bitcoin is something that isn't computationally impossible to reverse engineer, right? It's just computationally hard. There's no technology today that can say we can reverse engineer a cryptographic one-way hash function easily. But in the future, maybe with quantum computers, it'll be really trivial for us to brute force that solution. So those are things that can happen, but also at the same time, the code itself can be modified over time, right? Someone can fork it and just have a system that's resistant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It seems pretty hard to make kind of obvious decisions in the Bitcoin community.
Yep.
A little bit to just
Yeah.
Yeah, that's So what's that?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, great question. Thanks. Yeah. So basically, it seems like it's pretty hard to come to consensus in the Bitcoin community, right? So how are decisions made? And that's a great question. And actually, this is a difference between a lot of different systems, where Bitcoin itself specifically has a hard time coming to consensus because there's no clear leader. So Satoshi Nakamoto made Bitcoin, and then he just left, right? Like at some point, he's like, all right, like it seems like this thing's taken off. I don't have to be here anymore. So he's no longer there. So what happens now is that there are a lot of ideological splits and camps that now have influence over Bitcoin. And in fact, so there are people who have real influence, and then there are people who are like these like leaders, right? Thought leaders in the case. So for example, this is what happened very recently. A huge question was the scaling debate. So Bitcoin is now actually reasonably expensive to use for small microtransactions. And the reason for that is because the blockchain is actually an incredibly inefficient system to convey information, because it's something that's replicated across every single computer that is a full node, right? And so you want to keep this ideally as small as possible. And so right now, all blocks are limited to being 1 megabyte in size. And this is a huge problem in some philosophies, because it means that there are only a tiny amount of transactions that can be fit in each block at any given point. And specifically, miners are rationally self-interested in accepting transactions that pay them the most money. So with every transaction you can specify how much money you want to go as a reward to miners. And of course, if they can only fit a finite number in here, they're going to fit the ones that pay them the most money, right? So that means that now transactions, if you want them to happen quickly, they take a lot of money. And so a lot of people were like, well, this is a huge problem. Why don't we solve it with the most intuitive solution, which is just increase the block size, right? So that's what happened with Bitcoin Cash. There are a lot of these people who are like, well, this is obvious. Let's just make the block size larger, right? Let's go from 1 megabyte to 8 megabytes, and that's going to be sufficient to solve this transactional problem. But a lot of people also think that this is a short-term, short-sighted solution, right? Because it makes the problem go away right now, but it's not going to make the problem go away forever, because increasing the blockchain is something that's going to be finite, and as more transactions happen, it's still going to be a problem in the future. So you're basically kicking the bucket down the road. But at the same time, it also makes the blockchain so large, right? It makes it 8 times as large going forward, such that it'll be much more difficult for it to be decentralized, for people to be able to actually hold enough data to make this possible. And so what happened in this case is it was extremely difficult to come to consensus, because there was no one clear person who was a spiritual leader, right? Take an example for Ethereum, where when the DAO hack happened, actually within a month, they hard forked, right? And they actually made a new currency that reversed that transaction, because there was clear leaders, right? Like Vitalik was like, all right, like I made this thing, right? I think this is the right decision. People followed him and believed him very strongly. With Bitcoin, there's Bitcoin Core, right? There are these core developers that technically contribute to the code, but they don't actually have that much power, right? Because they contribute to the code, but the people who have a lot of power are miners, right? Because they're the people who actually provide the security behind the system. And so those people are actually very rationally interested in increasing the blockchain size, because the alternative solution that people are proposing right now is the Lightning Network. So the Lightning Network, for example, is an off-chain second layer solution. So what we mean by that is transactions, they take the philosophy that transactions on the blockchain are always going to be inherently limited in size, right? You can't possibly fit every single transaction you ever want on the blockchain. So instead, why don't we just take transactions off the blockchain and make extremely cheap, extremely fast transactions off the blockchain possible. And so what you do now is you open basically what are called payment channels. And how you open the payment channel is, say, Alice and Bob, right? They want to send money back to each other, so they have $100 each. They do a multi-signature transaction, so they both agree to basically put one transaction on the blockchain. So they put they both sign this transaction, they put $100 in this thing, they open a payment channel, and then in that payment channel, what they can do is they can send money infinitely back and forth to each other in the form of ICOs without closing this on the blockchain itself, without paying any costs. So maybe they paid $3, right, to make this first transaction, that goes on the blockchain, and then in the future, say Alice is like, oh, I owe you $7 for like a Uber ride, right? So she pays $7 to Bob, and now their balances update such that Alice now has $93 in this IOU, right? And Bob has $107, right? And they can send, say, 1,000 transactions back and forth on this IOU thing before settling on the blockchain. It doesn't matter, right? Because as long as they both have some non-zero balance, right, they can keep sending money back and forth. And then, say, 1,000 transactions later, they finally decide to close this thing. They pay another like $3, right, to actually finally settle. It's like Alice ends up with $50 and Bob ends up with $150. They settle it on the blockchain. and now they've only paid for 2 transactions on the blockchain, even if they've sent 1,000 transactions back and forth to each other, right? And this actually can scale because you can have nodes that connect to other nodes, even if you don't have a direct connection with another party. Say Bob is connected with Kathy, right? And like Alice now can send money to Kathy through Bob, even if they don't have a direct connection. So through hubs, you can basically send money to anyone through the system, and you really solve kind of this problem of like on-chain transactions. You just move most of transactions off-chain. And so the problem is, this is a solution that makes a lot of sense to a lot of people because it is a like long-term sighted solution that will like obviate the problem of like we always need to keep increasing the block size. But is against the rational self-interest of miners, right? Because miners don't make any money when you do off-chain transactions. They only make money when you put transactions on the blockchain, right? And so of course they want all the transactions to stay on the blockchain. So that's why they would advocate for, say, an 8x blockchain size, right? And so because there are these like malaligned economic incentives, it's really hard to come to consensus even beyond the fact that there's no economic leader. So it is a problem, yeah. I think I saw yours first.
I find the claims about the scarcity a little bit dubious
Mhm.
because I think you already mentioned that you start different cryptocurrencies.
Exactly.
And so this all hinges upon Bitcoin being basically de facto reserve currency. And I mean, I find it questionable that that would be the case just because of the other incentives. Like it doesn't have to be a government. It could just be a bunch of companies saying like, okay, we are going to accept this other currency, and it will basically make Bitcoin worthless because we want to go shop with this other currency on Amazon or something like that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So basically, you're right. Like Bitcoin itself is inherently scarce in the sense that like Bitcoins will not increase in value, but people can just make many different other currencies. So that was the question: is like, is it really scarce? Are cryptocurrencies really scarce because you can just have infinitely many different cryptocurrencies? And that's actually correct, right? But it's the same reason that like gold, for example, no one has to use gold, right? There are many other elements that we could use as a store of value, but people don't use those, right? So ultimately, it comes down to what trust do people have in these other currencies that are created? And in fact, Bitcoin itself has been forked thousands of times, right? And like the vast majority of those forks technically are indistinguishable from Bitcoin but have no value, right? Because people haven't placed any trust in it. So the real question is, will people actually want to place trust in something else that's not Bitcoin itself? And yeah, you're absolutely right. Maybe there are forced utility use cases, like you say, right? All these banks or a consortium of like retailers get together and they're like, in order to use Amazon, you have to use Amazon coin or something like that, right? And then that gives like some forced utility to people wanting to use that system. And that's certainly a possibility, right? Certainly other cryptocurrencies have value, right? Like right now, Bitcoin's worth under $70 billion. The total market is like $300 billion, right? So clearly, people want to put faith in other currencies. But at the same time, right, it is scarce, right? Bitcoin itself is scarce. And as long as people want to trust Bitcoin, and there are a lot of reasons that you actually want to trust Bitcoin, because one, like, sure, they have the first mover advantage, right? They already have a large body of trust, but also something needs to be a lot better than Bitcoin to actually replace it on like this reason of trust, right? Like if someone made exactly the same Bitcoin, there's no reason for someone to want to do that, right? So then the question is there anything that can be a lot better than Bitcoin? I think that is, that's really up for debate. And I think there's a lot of evidence for that not being the case. It's Bitcoin, like people say, for example, Ethereum is a really easy case of like, of course people want to use Ethereum because it's so much more useful, right? Like you can program anything you want on it. It can be used for almost any of these applications. You can make Amazon coin on top of it, right? You can make an ERC20 token that lives on top of Ethereum. So why would someone want to use Bitcoin? Well, actually, there are a lot of trade-offs, right? With all of these things, Bitcoin makes very few promises. Bitcoin promises to be a currency that works really well. Ethereum makes an enormous amount of promises. And each of those promises is something that can damage trust if they don't fulfill that promise. So specifically, you can actually have smart contracts as a second layer on top of Bitcoin itself. So you can have a risk smart contract that works basically the same as like Ethereum smart contracts would. But Ethereum has designed that to be part of its base layer, right? So the scripting language for Ethereum is Turing complete on its base layer. This is really bad for a lot of reasons. Possibly because the scripting language can be very poorly written and it can be like very subject to more exploits and vulnerabilities than Bitcoin itself would, right? Because Bitcoin has kept the attack space very small. And so, for example, with Ethereum, we've actually seen this happen a lot of times where there's a parody multi-sig hack that happened recently where they lost like $150 million, right? And that was because the guy, this is literally the guy who made the Ethereum yellow paper, right? He basically created the scripting language on Ethereum called Solidity, right? And he used it for parody. But the scripting language like is not that well written to be very secure, such that like he introduced a very simple bug basically where he called you want to like initialize a library function, and like you want to save on gas costs, so you reuse the same code over and over again. So he initialized this library, but in the library there was a function that you could call that would basically reinitialize a wallet and assign a new owner to this wallet. And so of course this is a function that you only want to be able to call once, right, to start this thing, and then no other person should be able to call this function method. But unfortunately what he did was he wrote this code and he didn't realize that he actually put an edge case in this code where it said, if you send money, this is to create a multi-sig wallet. So if you guys are familiar, a multi-sig wallet is a wallet where you can have multiple owners, such that you have three out of 5 people need to sign a transaction before it actually goes live. And so in this case, it's supposed to be the most secure thing ever, right? Because like you don't have one central point of failure, you have like 5 different points of failure, so it's a lot more robust. But in fact, you could just circumvent this whole system if the code itself was vulnerable, right? And so that's what happened, because he had an exception handler where it was a very friendly exception handler. It said basically that if you tried to call a function that wasn't defined in the code for the multi-sig itself, don't worry about it. We'll actually search all our libraries and see if the function is called there, right? And so if the function is defined there, then we'll just like call it for you. So then someone just like called these like multi-sig wallets and like called the function to reinitialize the wallet and assign themselves as the owner, and it just went through, right? And so that's a problem with like maybe having more functionality on top of like Bitcoin itself. Just as one example for why Bitcoin actually is like a very well done system that it may be hard for something to supersede.
I actually don't. So I actually disagree with Ben on some of this stuff. I think, so from my perspective, I think with the scarcity, I think that is an inherent problem. I think, for example, having a currency as a store of value, right? There is a lot, in the same way that gold is function, there is a lot of value within that. I actually think, like, and this is similar, like, given the incentive alignment, we have miners, different reasons for different parts of Bitcoin to evolve. It's actually really interesting. And also thinking about, for example, proof of work right now. Right now, what that's led to is just giant mining farms, for example, in China and other places, in which there's been an enormous amount of computational power spent generating random numbers that has no real utility or value, right? In the same way, like, for example, if you look at Ethereum's case, right, the difference is that you're actually using computational power to actually run code on the network. So I think it's interesting. From my perspective, is that I think there is going to be a solution. Whether it's Bitcoin inevitably, I think it has the clear first mover advantage. But I think, better, for example, better proof of whatever it might be, systems might actually end up becoming better, and then you might have new technologies that evolve. Like, I think this is all up in the air in terms of there's so much innovation going to happen, and Bitcoin is just one that we all know and we think. But whether it becomes a clear winner in the long run, like, right, I think there's a lot of debate clearly, right, around a lot of this stuff that's happening and what technologies can be better. So this is something, but I think one takeaway is that scarcity is important in terms of people trusting within the currency, but there are clearly problems with what we have already, and there's going to clearly need to be innovative solutions to scaling going forward. Yeah.
I agree with that, right? It's not a binary system. It's not like winner takes all, right? There's certainly room for many different players, and specifically because there are trade-offs with every system that you would implement, there are 2 systems that may work for better different purposes, right? So,
Yeah.
Should I go to the mic or?
We can repeat the question. We can repeat the question. One more last question.
Totally.
Yeah. So what do you think of the security issues? So right now, like if I buy some coins,
Yeah.
either I can leave them like the exchange or like
Yeah.
trust like a third party to store my coins for me. So
Totally.
it's basically like defeating the purpose of Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
Or I can put it in cold storage and then like put it in like a bank vault on the paper note or like try to remember it in my head. But like if I die, then those coins are lost forever. So
absolutely.
there's kind of, like, no perfect way to store coins right now.
Exactly.
So what do you guys use first?
Yeah, that's
what do you think,
great
what do you think
question.
is like the future?
No one take my backpack right now. Yeah. But anyway, so very specifically to your point, that's a great question. So the question again was, security seems like a trade-off with Bitcoin, right? Because the fundamental value proposition is you own your own money, but with great power comes great responsibility, right? If you control your own money, then it's hard to spend, and if you spend it, it can be compromised, like all these things. You can lose your own coins, you can lose your private keys. So instead, should you keep it on like an exchange, right? Like, which takes the analog of a bank, but then the bank can just like lose its money or like go out of business or get hacked itself and all these things. So there are these fundamental trade-offs. So that's a great question. I would venture to say that actually is something that today is certainly in its nascent form, right? I really do say it's like analogous to the internet in 1995, right? It was like a clunky, terrible thing that was extremely difficult for most people to use, right? Like any grandmother now can use Facebook because you press some buttons, right, and it works, or Google or YouTube. But like back then, it's like you have to understand how HTTPS works or TCP/IP and like write code in like a terminal command line, right? And that's the same thing with the system today, right? Like you have to understand how to keep your cryptographic private key secure, right? How to send money to some random hex string address, right? What that even means and all this stuff. And so you're absolutely right. It is a problem today, and it's very scary. But even today, we can already see good solutions coming out, right? So there's this fundamental question that you have of like, cold storage versus hot storage, right? So hot wallet is something that touches the internet. You assume that anything that communicates with the internet is fundamentally compromised because the internet is a fundamentally insecure layer, right? So the most secure thing that people do is you keep your money on something that has never touched the internet, right? So what you can do is, for example, you have a laptop that you never do anything with the internet for. You just download the program on it, and like you generate your random, private key and public key pair, and then you put your money in there, and then you never touch it. So no one on the internet could possibly steal this money. But that's extremely arduous, hard to like use, and someone could like steal your laptop, or your laptop burns up, or something like that, right? And it's gone. And so actually today we can already see some alternatives. So what I personally use, for example, are hardware wallets. So hardware wallets solve this problem well because it's basically an air-gapped system that does allow you to use the money, but also keep it secure and away from the internet. So the two largest ones are Trezor and Ledger Nano S. Yep. And they take two different approaches to it, but let's talk about the Trezor. So Trezor is beautiful because what it does is it's basically a hardware piece of thing that you actually hold that actually stores your private keys on it. And then what it does is you connect it through like micro USB to your computer, but the private keys will never be transmitted to the actual internet or your computer or anything like that, because all you actually have to do to send a transaction is you have to sign a transaction with your private key. You don't have to transmit the private key yourself. So what it does is it actually signs the transaction. So what you do is you use software on your computer, and it's like, all right, let's send $1,000 to some random address, right? And then it's like, all right, let's send this transaction to your Trezor. It sends it to Trezor, and then on the Trezor side, all it has to do is it signs this transaction on the Trezor itself, and then it sends the signature to your computer, but never sends your private key, right? So again, now you have a system where you have something that's air-gapped, that is safe in of itself, theoretically at least, right? But that you're able to use every day for sending transactions. So that's one example. Again, multi-signatures are another example, right? It's something where you have control yourself over this thing, and yet you have like multiple points of failure, right? It's not just like you lose your one thing and it's all gone, right? You can do multiple things there. And even so, like I think over time, realistically, if this becomes adopted as a global currency, we'll see even more security measures in place. For example, Coinbase has insurance on all their hot wallets, right? So actually, I do keep some of my coins on Coinbase. My whole thesis is don't keep all your eggs in one basket, right? So I keep some on my Trezor, I keep some on my Ledger, I keep some in Coinbase, and all these places, because Coinbase, maybe they like, this is their job, right? To keep this money secure. Chances are they're doing a much better job of it than like I myself could like replicate. And so, for example, what they do, right, is like they actually do secret sharing. They split up all their private keys into like multiple redundant parts, and no one employee or no one person has control over each of these parts. But like they put them in like safe deposit banks all over the world, and like it would be extremely difficult for someone to be able to actually find each of these and take the money. So they have that as their cold storage solution, and then for their hot wallet solution, because an exchange must necessarily have some coins touch the internet, right? So how do they do that? Well, they just insure it, right? So they actually have Lloyd's of London that insures all their hot wallet things, such that you have that security in place, right? So I think over time solutions will happen that.
Key point, just diversify. Just really quick, use, there's a bunch of different solutions. Storage and hardware wallets tends to be the safest. I use Ledger Nano personally. Yeah, just really quick. Yeah.
Thank you, Ben,
Yeah.
Simar. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.